Hello all, welcome to lesson 9 of the Rook Endgames series. This lesson will be dedicated to the Vančura draw. Well, the Vančura draw is a position that was composed by the Czechoslovakia Josef Vančura. He was an amazing person and he basically revolutionized the approach to many basic rook endgames. And so this position is very important. I also want to read you the news that was posted on the Journal of Czechoslovak Chess Players in February 21st of 1922, after his death, because I think it resumes the amazing short life this composer had. So, Josef Vančura, he was born on August 1898 in Smíchov. He was not yet known to the chess public on a collection of about 70 studies and endgames after his tragic death on November 1921. So, as you see, he was only 23 years old when he died. But before he has passed in a tragic death, he was able to compose 70 studies, including this Vančura position that I am naming it here as the Vančura draw technique that really improved a lot from previous positions that people thought white was winning. And so, to end the news, this gives an idea of how great a loss our chess community suffered with his passing. If you were able to get to know his survivors, the compositions that are tasteful works, finely pointed with precise construction, which is surprising, especially for a beginner. So you see how amazing this guy was. And this famous position, the Vančura position, was published only posthumously in 1924. So he even was unfortunately not able to see how important he brought to the Rook Endgames this composition. So, but let's go to the main idea that brought you here. Of course, it's to understand how can we draw from this position. So here we see that the pawn is still on the 6th rank, which is far more important than to go to the 7th. Let's just review what happens if we go there. This is a mistake because we simply place our rook behind the pawn, and if you don't know yet, you are going to know it now. When the rook is in front of the pawn, it's kind of powerless, and when the rook is behind, it's very strong. So let's change here the position just a bit. So now we have white rook behind the pawn, so we just change the rooks, and we place black rook in front of the pawn. So just to see how different it is to attack with a good rook or to attack with a very passive one that we are going to get back on the main position. So here, as you can see, there's a race to grab the pawn, but now we attack the rook. So the rook needs to get away, otherwise we take the rook, of course, and it's an easy win. Let's say, for example, the rook comes to h8. Well, that's simply a promotion and now a sacrifice. So you see that having the rook behind or in front, let's come back to the position of interest to us, so makes all the difference, because now even if the white king wants to approach the pawn, then we check it, so we come back to the a file. So as you can see, there's not much. Notice here just a bit that to lose tempo, the king needs to stay on these two squares also, g7 and h7. The idea is we can't go with f7 because there's a trick over here. So the rook goes to the other side, so threatening to check from behind and to promote the pawn. So basically, if the rook takes the pawn, I simply grab the rook. So always pay attention to these details. So the king needs to stay defending on this side of the board, but it's enough because white is not going to be able to kick away our rook. So we are seeing from the defensive perspective, and so as you can see, it's going to be a draw. So let's get back to the beginning. So we already know that we can't advance the pawn, otherwise it's an easy draw for black. So here the idea is white is needing the king to help promote the pawn. So let's start approaching the king. And basically the technique is to have our rook to check from the side, of course, from one of these squares. And only after the king come back, the rook goes back to the 6th rank. And if the king tries to approach the rook, we basically come to b6. Let's see this in action. Let's see first what happens if the king tries to go inside. As you can see, the king, when the king goes up, we just deliver checks and there's no progression for white. So basically, after a while, white may try to approach our rook, but we just go back to f6. And if the king comes near the rook again, when we go to the other side, b6, so the king can't progress, and we already know that if the pawn advances, we just go behind and it will be a draw. So after this move, the king can come again, but then we're just going to repeat this until we exhaust the possibilities and stay with a draw. So basically, the Vančura position allows us to understand the technique of delivering checks and stay with the rook in the 6th rank if the king is away. So to guarantee the draw, and if the pawn advances, we just go behind. Let's see here this in action in a game. This game was from Gatakamsky against Anatoly Karpov. This was played in 1994 in the famous Linares tournament, and we are seeing black advancing the pawn from the white perspective. We are now seeing this from white. And so how can we draw this with white? Well, we simply start by checking the king. Of course, the king goes to the side, and now we are going to prepare our Vančura technique. So we bring the rook to the g file. So it's black to play. Probably he advances the. It can advance the pawn, of course. Let's not make the mistake of, for example, going with the rook with b1. Otherwise, we simply check and take the pawn. So black needs to keep maneuvering, and that's what Karpov is doing. But now we simply bring the rook attacking the pawn. So this is basically the idea. We always place the rook sideways attacking the pawn. The pawn advances, so now we check. The king can go up or down. It's a matter of taste. If it goes down, we simply go to the b3 square. So remember, we want to stay in the same file, in the same rank of the pawn. If the pawn advances, then we go to a3. And so here, well, the king can approach. When it's approached, I can go back and so on. But let's see this like it happened on the game. So the king went up. So I went there anyway. And now when the rook comes with check, I simply can go up or down. For example, this is more normal in my opinion, but okay. Gatakamsky decided to go up. There's also a similar possibility for a draw. So I came back and noticed that now I have my rook ready for the side checks. Of course, Karpov tried to go to a1, trying to trick us. So the threat now is to be able to advance the pawn with a check. But of course, white has tempo for protecting with playing king g2. And as you can see in action, we got the Vančura position, and the game ended here with a draw. Let's see this from another position, another starting position. So here, this was one of those positions that before Josef Vančura showed his composition, everyone was more or less convinced that white was winning. So the idea is bringing the king to b1, so to break the cutting off from the rook on the second rank. And then after reaching b1, we are going to approach our pawn, place the king in this safe square a7, then maneuver the rook outside, go with the king to the corner, advance the pawn, and then it's game over. Let's see this in action. So the king approaches. As you can see, black king is restricted to stay on those two squares. Otherwise, it's possible for white to play sums directly to the promotion. So now we attack the rook. The rook goes to a5, and our king now maneuvers to approach the rook. Let's make the mistake normal players do. So the rook goes to a4. We could also maneuver with the king. Doesn't matter. The mistake is still there. So now we attack the rook. The rook needs to come back. We keep approaching the pawn. The king now can go to f7. So the idea is to try to approach the pawn if the king if the white king also approaches. There's no threat of rook h8 because the pawn is not protected, so it's still on time for a draw if the king decides to come arrest the rook again. But here the king approaches the pawn, so now check again. The king is almost there, and now we reach this position. Well, so white was able to trick black into this kind of not efficient defense because the pawn was not on a7. If it was on a7, then this technique from black would be a draw, but not in this situation. So now the rook comes out, so forcing the rook to move, and now there's no way black is going to be able to save the game because another check, but now the king moves away, and of course the king is already outside, so the checks are going to finish after a while. Let's see, for example, over here, now the rook can come back, but the promotion is not possible to avoid, and so there's a win. So where was the Vančura technique coming in to help this situation? Well, first we start with the same move, so now we attack the rook goes to a5, and now I move to this critical position, and here we start to maneuver to reach the Vančura position. So we check the king, we check the king, so the king needs to move away, and now we get into the 6th rank. Remember this, we start by attacking the pawn, but from the side. So we are now on 6th rank, so the king approaches, and as you can see now, if you remember from the starting position of the lesson, this is exactly the Vančura position, so we are facing a Vančura draw. So I hope you have understand that we need always to pay attention to the position, and here the small detail is the pawn is still on the 6th rank and not on the 7th. So on the first line I showed that ended up with white winning. Basically, black was playing just as the pawn was on the 7th rank, which was not the situation. Let's go back and to finish the lesson to watch to another interesting position. So the difference here is the king is not on g7, it's still on h6. So we have a difference because basically white is threatening to check our king and then promote. So we need to be very fast on the approach to the position. This is going to use the Vančura drawing technique, okay? But we also have a big detail over here because our king is not in a perfect situation. Of course, we are now forced to check. If we are going to a1, as I told you, checking and then promoting. So as you can see now, the rook needs to take the queen and it's game over. So this one doesn't work. So I check from the G file. So the king now moves away, and I need to keep my rook attacking the pawn, but at the same time, I also need to take cover of this check. And here the move not so easy to see, but after I believe you are going to learn it and never forget it again, is to go with my king to g5. Notice that if I'm going to h7 is also a blunder because the rook sacrifice with check, and when I take the rook, there's a promotion, and now we have a queen versus rook in the game. Of course, I have the series about the rook versus the queen versus rook in the game that you can study to try to survive, but this is a loss for black, not in our interest. So let's come back. And so the key technique is to go to g5. Don't mistake yourself. We need some air for our rook to deliver the side checks. So we can't go also to g6. So we need to go to g5. Let's see what happens from here. So now the king approaches the pawn, so threatening now to remove the rook and promote the pawn in the next move. So we need to check it. That's why it's so important to go to g5 and not g6 on the previous move with the king. Now the king goes, and as you can see, there's no progression if the king stays trying to help the pawn. So the king needs to leave the pawn away. As soon as the king leaves the pawn away, well, we return attacking from the side the pawn. And now let's see what happens if the king tries to waste one tempo, like kind of passing the turn. Well, it's black to play, and as we saw, we can't go to g6. We can't also go to an open file because otherwise we are going to suffer a check and then watch a promotion. And so basically, the only move possible is to go to g4. So as you can see, there is a connection between this technique and the Vančura draw technique, which is great if we learn both. And so now the king can come, but I have the checks. The king can approach more, so threatening to reach our rook. And of course, now we don't need to wait to check again, so we can bring the king back to the g5, the g5 square. And so as you can see, there's no progression over here. Now I can't play this move because the king is too far away from its pawn. There's no check, and it's white to play again. So the king moves away, and I move away, and I guarantee the draw. So I hope you have enjoyed. As you saw, this technique is very useful. Let's bring it here to the first position. So keeping the rook able to deliver checks if the king enter the space of the pawn protection, so basically these three squares. And if the king tries to go to the side to the rook, then we will be able to maneuver to b6 and then go back to f6, and so we adapt to the position of the king and we guarantee the draw. Okay, it's enough for this lesson, and I see you again in future ones. Bye bye.